Okay, so this would be a revision of Unit 1, so we can do it better. And again, the main focus of this unit of the course is to what extent should ideology be the foundation of identity. Okay, obviously, that's a big word, but we'll break that down. Some of the curricular outcomes, some of the things that this PowerPoint is designed to teach you, primarily teach you about individualism, collectivism, some of the historic and modern examples. And the last point, there's not as much done in this version of the notes, so don't worry too much about that. Okay. But if you're ever wondering what are the primary principles of either of those ideologies, they're right there. Okay. And this set of notes goes down and breaks down each of those individually and gives you a much more clear understanding of what they were, because I know after we finish Unit 1, particularly with your first essay assignment, a lot of you were a little unsure. Okay. So ideologies expanded. This chart will help you. Sometimes the diploma uses alternative words for these ideologies, for these systems. Okay. In the middle, you have people who are moderate in terms of their ideology. They're not too extreme on one end or the other, right? And just slightly outside of that, to the right side, you have conservatives, people who want to keep things the same. Okay, that's what it's just think of the word conserve. What does it mean to conserve energy? It means to save energy. What does it mean to conserve some sort of wildlife area, to protect it, to keep it the same? Right? That's what conservatives are trying to do. Liberals are people who are more open towards change, new ideas, new ways of doing things. Right? So you might notice that as a temperament. Some of you might not be as interested in trying new things as others of you. I for one am very high in openness as a personality trait. So it means that I'm much more open to new ideas, new experiences, and just new things in general. Okay. These two words on the end usually confuse students, and sometimes there's a question or two, a couple questions related to the terms at the end. On the far right side, you have reactionary. These people are reacting to too much, liberalness, too much newness, and they want to change things back to the way they used to be. Okay, so these people are also they're not necessarily as radical or dramatic as people on the left, but they also want big change, but they want it to go back to the way things were, right? So, one thing you could look at is gender roles. So now in modern society, it's not clear what men and women should be doing or could be doing, and a lot of people say that, well, men and women can do everything and anything. Someone who's on the reactionary front might say, well, we should return things back to the way they were in, let's say, the 60s, where the men went to work and the women stayed home and raised the family and kids. Okay, so that's a reactionary. They're conserving the older status quo. Someone on the radical front wants a high degree of change. Right? Think about it, they're very radical. They want to change things dramatically, potentially quickly. Right? So speaking on the same topic of gender, let's say the example of nowadays you see people who are born as males, at 16, 17, 18 as adults, they want to compete in women's sports. That might be considered something that's very radical, it's very different, it's very new. And people aren't so sure if that's the right thing to do or not. Right? So this chart, this desire for change chart is also very helpful. You should know those 5 terms across the board there. Looking at the 2 ideologies that this course focuses on, we have individualism, which is on the right side, so that's a concern for a person's own well-being. All right, and everyone's going to have a mixture of this. Some people are very much towards the right. They really don't care about other people at all for a variety of reasons. On the left side of the spectrum, you have collectivism, which is a concern for the well-being of others in society. Right, and that can relate to empathy and compassion. So people who are higher in compassion, which is another personality trait, they're going to be very concerned about other people's well-being. And that's probably about half of you that are, let's say, to put it this way, who are more concerned about someone else's well-being than maybe your own. A small percentage of you will be very much on that right side where you're very much self-interested, right? So maybe you're lower in compassion as a trait, personality trait. And again, if you ever want to understand these two ideologies and their basic principles, always go back to this slide. So individualism really which is also liberalism, which is what we learned at the first part of the second unit. It emphasizes things like rule of law, individual rights and freedoms, private property, economic freedom, self-interest, competition. We'll break those down, we'll look at that. Collectivism, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite of that. So economic equality, cooperation, public property, collective interest, collective responsibility, and adhering to collective norms. So we'll break that down. There's a good acronym you can remember for collectivism, which is PRINCE. So you have the public property, responsibilities, interest, norms, cooperation, economic equality. A basic definition of collectivism is that it emphasizes human interdependence, that we need one another to survive, to have a good life, to be, let's say, mentally and emotionally and psychologically healthy, that you need other people, but also financially well off. And maybe you need other people to help you out and take care of you. Collectivism sees human beings as social creatures and emphasizes the idea that companionship, so that would be like friendship, and the support and approval of others contribute to our personal happiness and fulfillment. So collectivism is essentially just based off of groups, okay, and caring about other people. Some examples historically speaking, so obviously, if you were to live in a small hunter-gatherer group of people, there's 25 to 150 of you and there's no grocery stores, you really need one another to survive. Has anyone ever gone hunting? Out of curiosity, a couple of us, right? Now it's pretty easy when you have a gun because you can shoot things from far away. But imagine you needed to sneak up on an animal. It'd be very challenging, and maybe you need a group of people, right? Maybe you have, and particularly, let's say you're using a spear. Like, has anyone? I mean, kids don't really do track and field anymore. Have you kids ever done the javelin throwing? Okay. How many of you are good at that? Kind of all right. Okay. So we got two people who are good at throwing. So we pray that you actually hit the animal. How many of you like running? I definitely don't. You like running. You like running. Great, so you're going to throw the spear and run after the animal. How many of you can run for a long time? How many of you even exercise? Okay, so some of you could, right? So maybe you break up the responsibility. Like the people who are good at throwing, they try to hit the animal, wound it, and some people chase it down. That's actually how humans hunted animals. They just ran them down. The animal got exhausted, eventually died. It was bleeding. But at some point, way back, a long time ago, 5,000-10,000 years, you really needed the people around you to survive. You couldn't live on your own and survive just by yourself like you can now. Like nowadays, you can have your own job, you can make a nice income, live in your own house. You really don't need other people, right? Because you can pay for all these services. But obviously, within a group of 35 people, you can really manage both the relationships and expectations. So you can figure out real easily in this group of people who you might want to have for a project. Like who's actually going to do the work, who's going to make you do all the work, who's going to give you intelligent contribution, who's going to make your day and life a little harder. It's very easy to figure that out with 35 people. But when you extend that to the school, how many of you feel confident about your knowledge of every person in this building? I know most of the kids in the building, right? But most of you don't, right? How many of you feel confident about your knowledge of everyone in Leduc? So the bigger these levels get, it's harder to know who the other person is, which makes it very difficult to be in a collective in a very large group of people. There's quite a bit of evidence as well that suggests that human groups historically in, let's say, hunter-gatherer times, their tribes maxed out at about 150 people. I think they call this the Dunbar number. Like, essentially what that means is that you can only intimately and personally know about 150 people. Beyond that, it's just too much, just given our evolution. Right? If you think about that, like how many close friends do you have? How many extended friend groups do you have? Which for your generation, sadly, that number is really like fallen off a cliff because of technology and social media and whatnot. It makes it hard to actually authentically connect with particular people. Although, you know, if you look at your follower and following count, you might have, I don't know, 500 followers. But do you really know all 500 of these people? Probably not. So the question there, you know, what challenges do large groups, so let's say 1,000 plus face that small groups don't? Right? What is something that is challenging in a group of 1,000 people that might not be much of a challenge in a group of 150? Right? Think about that in terms of social gatherings, right? Trying to deal with people. You've all been to mass at some point. It's hard to know who's causing problems at mass. Right? But given that it's a small school community, the same people who cause problems at every mass. So you learn pretty quick. But if there's 3,000 kids, that might be very hard. Here's some examples, just some pictures. So this is like a more modern hunter-gatherer group of people. As you can see, they're still using stone and wooden, we'll call it technology. Here we have like an image of people just starting to use tools. They even have animals that are helping them. It look like they're cultivating some of the food they've grown. You know, Egyptian society as well, the use of harvesting things. And these are smaller communities. It's easy to know people, right? Particularly like hunter-gatherers here. You know, they're trying to take down a woolly mammoth. I'm actually going to remove this picture because that's more of a feudal society, which isn't quite what we're going for. So for recent and modern examples of collectivism, you have democratic socialism, which is kind of what we experience today, right? So democratic means it's a process where people get to vote and express their opinion politically through that vote. The change is slower, it takes more time, right? So they voted in Trudeau and the Liberal Party for prime ministership and governing Canada. But he got a minority party, but you still have to wait a handful of years before there's another democratic process to have a different political party potentially lead the country and a different person. You also have welfare states, which is essentially, you know, the government gives out a lot of financial handouts, right? And we'll talk about that in economic equality. The government is giving you a variety of services that help you to deal with the financial stress of life. Okay, we also have all the way to communism, which we just finished learning about. That's a very extreme form of, you know, collectivism, left-wing politics. Okay. So even with the modern examples, it still includes the basics that we saw in the previous slides. The concern, I also have the perceived concern and care for the welfare of others. And the caveat on that is, you know, just because you say you care about other people and you care about their well-being and you want the best for them, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what ends up happening, right? If you remember what we learned about collectivization in Russia, it didn't go so well for the wealthier peasants. It didn't go very well for millions of people. It didn't go well for the Ukrainians, who probably received the same message from Stalin, from the political leaders, that, hey, we're creating a utopia. Same in China. Mao Zedong says that we're going to pull the country forward, but 60 million people died in that process. Many of them starved to death. So just because you say you care about other groups of people and other people in general doesn't mean you actually do. A lot of this is conducted through taxation and social programs, right? That's how socialism really works. You know, your taxes aren't based on the kindness of your heart. How many of you work again? Like, how many of you get a pay stub regularly? A couple of you. So, do any of you get taxed? Do you see that? You get taxed? Okay. And you're over 18, right? No?
Oh wait, no, never mind.
Okay. Once you get over 18 on your pay stub, you'll see how much taxes you get. Again, that's not out of the kindness of your heart. That disappears from your paycheck before the money enters your bank. So you don't get to decide whether or not you want to give into these programs. Right. Whereas if there was less taxes and you got more money, maybe you could decide if you wanted to give money to a charity. Although that value isn't really taught so much in society. Okay. Redistribution of wealth, we already looked at that, at times by force. So we saw that in Russia with the kulaks, where these wealthier peasants didn't get a choice to say, they didn't really get a choice to say yes or no. I mean, you could say no, but maybe you get shot, maybe you get sent to a work camp. Which doesn't sound like a lot of fun, right? So again, this isn't always based off of the kindness of your own heart. Oftentimes it's been decided for you. Okay. So looking at, I thought there was a slide in between. Looking at some of the aspects of collectivism, first one, public property. Public property in a more collectivist state can be just about anything. So schools, for example, are public property. Like, this isn't my classroom, I just borrowed it. Okay, the school is paid for and funded by tax dollars, more or less, particularly public education. Public property is owned by the state, which is the government, or the community, and managed according to the best interests of the community. That's a textbook definition. How many of you have seen your neighborhood's community hall? Right. This should be like a small building. Maybe there's an outdoor rink nearby. There's maybe some basketball courts, playground, but there's always a building for each neighborhood. Right. So that could be considered public properties, but it's owned by the community. And the community is able to decide what they do and do not want to do with the space, with the money that they bring. Okay. Ownership can vary depending on communities and ideologies. In communism, all property can be owned and managed by the state and organized by their decisions. Karl Marx argued that only workers should profit from their own labor, not the employers and owners. Right. But in that situation, you got to ask yourself, who takes all the risks? Like, let's say you start a business and you hire 10 people. Who takes the risk? Like, what if your business goes bankrupt? So the workers should profit from their labor, not you, the owner. But if the business goes bankrupt, is everyone going to share in that bankruptcy? Probably not, unless they really like you. Okay. A couple private property, public property meetings. This bottom one expresses the sentiment. A lot of collectivists believe that any private property is theft. You shouldn't be able to own things. Right? Stalin was pretty notorious for seizing and redistributing people's property, okay, and sending them off to prison for that. They resisted. Okay. Collective responsibility, again, looking at the principles of collectivism. This one is that everyone is responsible for the actions of each other. They really utilize this in the military. They utilize this in more hierarchical structures. So, and that's kind of hard to do nowadays, but think about it as a team. You win as a team, you lose as a team. Right? Just because you scored, if it's basketball, just because you scored 35 points doesn't mean you get to go home and party if your team lost. Right? It's a collective responsibility. Ultimately, you all have to come together to win. Assuming that's what you want to do. Okay. There's no individual action for which the group cannot in some way be held accountable for. Some of the challenges that might come from this is, can the whole, let's say one individual does something bad in a group. Does that make everyone responsible for that person? It might not, it really depends. Here's just some examples of collective responsibility. And this is actually from a beach, I believe, in India, which was covered in trash. And you might say that, well, it's the government's responsibility to do something, and it might be the government's responsibility, But if you live by the beach and you go there every day and you see trash all the time, you might take the individual responsibility to get some people together. And as a collective, like, it's everyone's responsibility to keep the space clean, is it not? Like, who's responsible for keeping this classroom clean during block D? Is it just me? Is it the janitors? Is it each and every one of you? Right? We all have a responsibility to an extent. How many of you have a dog? Quite a bit of you. You know, it's your responsibility as an owner and the collective responsibility of dog owners to clean up after their pet, right? To make sure that that stuff gets thrown out properly, right? Not just hung up on a tree branch. We don't need to go over that. Collectivism is also founded, one of its primary principles is collective interest. So if you get into a group, it's likely because your group has some sort of shared interest. So, I don't know, maybe you have your clan in Clash of Clans. Like, what is your clan's interest? On basketball, what is your team's interest? What goal and objective are you working towards? As a group of seniors in high school, hopefully your collective interest is graduating, getting your diploma and leaving this place. The principle states that individual members may have individual interests, but these interests are often better addressed by making them a common set of interests that the group can address together, which is repetition of a lot of words, but you might have your own individual goal, but you should bring that up to the group and see if the group wants to pursue that goal together. On teams, it's very easy. You know, typically you're trying to win, maybe you're trying to have the best outcome. So that should be very straightforward, but as a classroom, it might be difficult to figure out your collective interest. Okay, it can be the foundation of social movements and lobby groups, so the civil rights movement, we'll see a photo of that in a moment as well. So obviously there's the collective interest of all Black Americans to gain equality within the borders of the United States. But it might also be the collective interest of the United States to have more access for a significant portion of their population to participate in society. Any of you seen the movie 42? It's about Jackie Robinson. It's a really good movie. It's on Netflix.
Is that with Chadwick Boseman?
Yeah, Chadwick Boseman stars as Jackie Robinson, but you know, they bring up the issue, like the owner of the Brooklyn team essentially states that, hey, there's all these Black people who watch baseball, they have their own Black teams. Why don't we bring in that revenue? The movie starts off that way. I don't know if his actual goal was to make more money, but it's not wrong to want to make more money. Eventually, the movie's narrative shifts where the owner and many of the players just start to see and recognize, like, yeah, it's actually wrong that we don't allow Black people to play. It's wrong the way they get treated. And so the collective interest changes. The photo on the right is a photo from a protest from the Alberta Teachers Association. So as a union, a labor union, we also have, to some extent, a collective interest. Now, not every individual is going to agree with that mission, the goal that you have, but as a community, you come together and maybe come up with a bunch of goals that majority of members can agree upon. You could think about it like, if you've ever gone out to eat with a group of friends, how do you make the decision of where to go? Let's say there's 4 or 5 of you there with some family, friends, whatever it is. You all have the collective interest of getting something to eat, but how do you figure out what you're actually going to eat? Okay, adherence to collective norms, building on that example, would be, so 4 of you in the car want to go to Burger King, 1 of you wants to go to Wendy's. You know, the collective norm might be that, well, you know, for that 5th person, they just gotta suck it up. We gotta go to Burger King. But if they just decide, like, you know what, screw you guys, I'm not hanging out with you. Maybe that is or isn't accepted, right? Maybe you do and do not accept being a childish baby and whining about it, right? And so what do you do when that person breaks off? Maybe they start their own collective, their own group, right? But if they continue to do that, are they going to be a part of your friend group? If they always whine and cry if they don't get their way, you're going to have to make that decision as a group of people, as a collective. Okay. So adherence to collective norms, this occurs when groups oppose norms or standards on their oppose. I might need to change that word there, but essentially the group is putting a standard onto you. So the school, as a collective, has a certain standard that's placed on all of you. And to me, it's not clear whether or not that standard is clear. And maybe the school hasn't done a good job of clarifying that. But it could be something like, hey, you show up to school, you treat others with respect. Right? That's obviously a rule that's applied to this classroom. And what happens when you don't adhere or follow that norm that's set? Okay, although the standards are voluntary, the group sees them as binding. They can relate to conduct, values, or appearance. How many of you work a job where you have to wear some type of uniform? Okay. Well, your next job, you'll have likely some sort of requirements, right?
I'm just the best.
So what happens when you show up to work without your uniform? Nothing? Okay, how many of you work a job that requires safety equipment? Okay, so what happens, like, you guys need steel-toe shoes?
Yes.
What happens when you don't show up with steel-toe shoes?
Probably gonna break your foot.
Probably gonna break your foot. They're likely gonna send you home.
Yes.
Right? So you have to follow that collective norm. It's a rule. Now, sure, you can show up every day without your steel-toe shoes, but you can also be looking for employment elsewhere before the end of the week. Right? So it's up to you to follow, but maybe you get kicked out of that group. We'll skip over this as well. Okay, second last one, cooperation. Obviously, with any group of people, you need to cooperate, right? So again, when you're in the car with 5 of your friends and one of you really wants to go to Wendy's and everyone else wants to go to Burger King, maybe that person will have to set aside their own self-interest and cooperate with the group and go along with what the group is doing for the sake of the group, right? Sacrificing your own desires, which can be hard over time, right? Like, what if every time you suggest something, everybody shuts it down? You know, how's that going to make you feel? Is that going to make you feel like a valued member of that group? Maybe, maybe not, right? You might struggle to feel that, and then you might make a decision on what you would like to do next. But generally, you cooperate. You work together. So in basketball, you know, even if you're the star player, let's say you're being guarded by 3 people. Does it make sense for you to try and force a play to happen? I mean, a lot of you probably watch hockey, same thing, right? There might be 2 people in front of you. You know, there's no clear shot. Just because you're the star player doesn't mean you just shoot at some guy standing in front of you, right? Maybe you try to highlight some of your teammates. You use cooperation. You work together to achieve the goal, the higher goal of winning the game, or acquiring food if you're in a hunter-gatherer group, tribal group, maybe raising children as well. Some of you will choose to have children in your lifetime. You're going to have to figure out how to cooperate with your partner. How do you do that process together? Because if you're raising your kids one way and your partner's raising their kids another way, it's probably not going to be good for the kids. So this cooperation may involve delegation of roles, meaning somebody might have to decide like who does what job, right? So on a team, there's always positions. And some people are blessed, they can play multiple positions, but as the competition level gets higher, you need to specialize. You might have to follow some sort of protocol for speaking, right? So if you want to raise your concern to a group, maybe you have to raise your hand. You know, it's very common in classrooms. Some sort of decision-making guidelines. So for example, in democracy, you know, you need at least half of the people to agree with something, which might beg the question, is 50% of you enough to say that the majority of you like this and that it won't leave too many people unsatisfied? right? Or should that number be raised to 75%? Like, let's say we ask a question to the class, right? So we could, for the hell of it, we could ask the question, how many of you would like to spend the last 10 minutes outside today? Okay. So 4 people raised their hand. So you didn't win the majority, right? So maybe we won't go outside today, right? The majority of you didn't vote, which is very common in democracies, right? So what was your collective responsibility when the question was asked? To vote. But you didn't do that. So now we're gonna sit inside. Okay. It's another big quote, but I'm just gonna hold that. Okay. Last one for collectivism is economic equality. This can include a variety of things. So the last time I taught this, I really emphasized how people being paid the same or relatively the same. And I still think equal wages for work of similar value. Again, that's kind of ambiguous from your textbook what that means. But I would say that in many more extreme socialist communities, a lot of people, there wasn't a lot of pay variation for regular people. Okay, and so that removes a lot of the incentive to work hard, let's say, to maybe spend 8 to 10 years in university holding off on making an income for a very specialized, high-paying job. My friend has done that. He's got his PhD in engineering and whatnot. But a couple of the ways that this can be done is progressive taxation. That's what they do in Canada, which means that the more money you make, the more you have to pay in taxes. And it basically adds on to every chunk of extra cash you make. It's not like someone who makes, $250,000 has to pay 75% of their income in taxes. It's not how it works. I have a chart that eventually I'll bring over. It could be something like a universal basic income. Have we ever heard that term before? A universal basic income would be basically the government might decide that they're going to give every citizen over the age of 18 $1,000 every month, potentially regardless of if they work, to try to boost the economy or whatever they're trying to do, whatever their goal is. That could be economic equality.
Is there a catch to that?
Sure. Well, the catch could be like, where does that money come from? How do we generate all that money, right? But many of the people who propose it say, no, it's $1,000 for free for you. The other catch might be that, well, then the value of your money gets lower, okay, right? Because of inflation. So, if everybody receives $1,000, then the $5,000 or $10,000 you had before is worth a little bit less, because all of a sudden everybody just got more money, right? And every month they get more money. So I do think it would lead to inflation eventually. I think Andrew Yang is one of the few people who logically explain how to prevent that. But even that, I don't know. Andrew Yang was somebody who's running for president in America. What's that? But it sounds very appealing, right? Like, how many of you would say no to a free $1,000? How many of you would love a free $1,000? It'd be great, right? But long term, the money you get might be worth less and less. You might not be able to buy as much with it. Everybody should share in the wealth of the country or the world. So that's like a real kumbaya kind of strategy that we'll all just get along and we'll share everything, and maybe we'll do it equally. But think about the last time you were having pizza with your family. Did you equally distribute the slices? Well, how many slices did you take?
I take a pizza to myself.
You take a whole pizza to yourself, right? But Karl Marx did say, to each to their own need. Maybe you need a whole pizza, right? But what about you? How many slices do you need? 2? How about you? Pizza? You take the whole pizza box as well? 3 pizza boxes. 3 slices. 3 pizza boxes. What about you?
I don't know, like 5.
That's a lie.
How much do
You do
think I
know.
eat?
You take 5 slices?
I don't know, I don't count.
There's not even eat.
The high, you gotta track their food, you wanna make gains. So everybody should share, but when you look at that practically, you know, for those of you who have siblings, maybe you've done this at some point in your life, you know, you try to evenly slice, you know, the last slice of cake in half, and it never happens. And you're always like, hey, you got more, or I got less. So that's hard. Let alone money. People love money. Last part of economic equality, you know, maybe this very extreme idea, but everything should be free. There should be no private property. We should all just have access to it. You know, it's like you like somebody's shirt, like, hey, it's my shirt now. You're done with that shirt, right? That source would be, that hope would be good to look at, but we won't do that right now. Okay, last part of the collectivism. On your diploma, it may ask you, you know, what is the main aspects of a command economy? I don't know why they use this particular phrasing because it's not used in the curriculum, but they use it on the diploma. A command economy is just like a planned economy. They're the same thing. And it basically operates with a group of people organizing everything. Okay, so if you look in the bold is words that you might find on this diploma assignment. I'm telling you this because it's very likely your diploma assignment could ask you that question. They only ask you a handful of questions on that WRA1. But the words in bold are essentially the words that you might see on your source that actually relate to planned and command economies, okay? But government ownership, that could be considered nationalization, collectivization, right? But the government owns things. They also direct the means of production, so central planning, something like that, right? So what that means is that the government decides how much food needs to be grown. They might say, hey, we only need 250 cows this year, but we need like 10,000 pounds of soybean because we're going to feed everybody soybean oil, right? Or maybe they start growing crickets and bugs, right? Like how many of you would eat bugs?
I'd try it.
You try it.
There's someone paid.
No. Like they're saying, hey man, cows are bad for the environment. You got to start eating bugs. That's what I'd say. Okay. Central planning. The government just decides, well, we need more of this and not a lot of that. You know, we only need one supercar. Only one of us gets it. Probably the person in charge. Right? You have government control of consumption and distribution. Again, this could look like central planning, government regulation. Okay, so the government is making these decisions on how much you can have of a thing, how much we should make and distribute it. Group well-being is key, so this could be cooperation, economic equality, common good. This could be social programs as well. Social programs I wouldn't necessarily put as one of my higher preferences, but you know, it is one if you're struggling, right? The main ones you want to take away is central planning, collectivization, nationalization, economic equality, cooperation. Like those 5 are all good topics to talk about if your question is asking about command or planned economies, right? And this relates to collectivism, right? Government control, right? Planning, organizing, quotations because it went horribly. And a challenge to this is that how do you achieve all of this planning and organization if you also need to listen to everyone's voice? But let's say there's 1,000 of you, right? Like how do we get feedback from all 1,000 of you? How many of you do that with the school right now? You'll give feedback. No. You don't either. You definitely don't. What, right? So how's this system supposed to work if you two don't give feedback? If you don't raise your voice? It doesn't work, right? What's that? Why doesn't it matter? Of course it matters. You're gonna be 18 this week. You're gonna be able to vote in the next election. Are you gonna vote? What?
I don't care.
Just draw heavy.
But then someone else is gonna lead over you, like someone maybe you don't like.
That's exactly what's happening right now.
And so it's our individual responsibility to educate ourselves on who's running for election, potentially, right? Because like you could always just focus on your own life and try to live your best life regardless of who's in government, right? Because personally, I don't think you should rely that much on the government to make your life better. I think you should be in charge of that. But I don't know if just not voting is the best thing either. Okay. We'll actually stop there for today.